So good morning and welcome, wherever you are. I know some of you. I'm Steve Hearson. I'm the convener of this conversation and inquiry, and I'm joined by Ben Tye. Good morning, Ben.
Morning, Steve. Morning, everyone.
We will do some brief introductions in a moment, but I just want to tee this up. Those of you who are joining, the reason why there are things about biscuits in the chat is because just by delicately getting people to arrive, I asked people to say if they had a biscuit with their morning cup of or evening cup of tea or coffee or glass of wine if you're in Australia, what might it be? Hence the slightly strange conversation in the chat. In terms of who I am a consultant. I'm a author of a book called No Silver Bullet, a supervisor and a coach. And amongst other things, I host a occasional series of webinars and conversations which are focused on talking about things that are, I use the word chewy, things that we may not normally find time to talk about because frankly they are a little bit uncomfortable, certainly within organizational contexts. And it's in this vein and in this line of conversations that I was delighted when I met Ben early this year, I think it was Ben. And after some conversations, we decided that this would be an interesting place to start. So before we tell you what we're going to talk about and how, Ben, would you do the honors of just explaining who you are?
Yeah. Morning, everyone. Steve, thank you for having me. This was hatched over a cup of tea and a cup of tea and cake, probably April, May time, I think it was. So yeah, really glad we've been able to pull this together today, and it's lovely to meet you all. My name's Ben Tye. I have been a transformation change consultant for 30 years. For the last 8 years, I have been at a business called GateOne, which is a digital and business transformation consultancy. I am the chief executive and managing partner of GateOne, so responsible for the business. So we're about 300 strong, with offices in London, Manchester, New York, Paris, Dublin, Bangalore. I'm also a UKCP integrative psychotherapist. Been trained in private practice now for 7-8 years, which that's what I do on a Monday. And I'm also a Tavistock Systems psychodynamic executive coach. So that's how I spend my time.
Lovely, thank you, Ben. So just to frame what we're going to do, excuse me, we've done some brief intros from me and Ben, and I'm going to touch just on some principles for which I suggest we work to. Then Ben and I are going to frame the territory through a conversation that will last about 15-20 minutes tops, I expect, before we move into some small group inquiry. And we'll have brief plenary between the two before closing inquiry. And that's essentially the structure that we're going to follow. In terms of contracting, these are loose working principles. If you've been on these calls before, these webinars, you'll know that they are lightly held, and to a large extent, I trust you all to be grown up and to take care of yourselves. But nonetheless, when we're talking about strong emotions and potentially some of the shadow side of organizational life in our work, it's important just to be more explicit about these things. So this is a gentle invitation to respect confidentiality, notwithstanding the fact that I am recording this. The small groups will not be recorded, but obviously the plenary will. Assume positive intent. There may be that some of you move into more chewy territory. So if it gets a little bit chewy, then assume positive intent amongst your colleagues. Be aware and take responsibility for your impact on others, and be kind, which is something that's quite radical, possibly, in the wider global conversation we have at the moment. And I think it's very important only to disclose what you wish to. Whilst we do actually have a registered psychotherapist in Ben with us today, we're not doing therapy, unless you're doing something, Ben, that you hadn't told me. But
No.
Right. So we're not doing therapy this morning. So there's no requirement if you to disclose anything you do not wish to. And it's absolutely fine not to be polished. I think amongst peers and amongst practitioners, I notice certainly myself, I can even feel it in the here and now, a certain need, even though I'm slightly bleary-eyed after a cold night sleeping, of a need to be polished and perfect for you all. I'm really sorry, but I'm not. So notice your own need to be polished and perfect. And ultimately take responsibility for yourselves. And when you are in the small groups, to co-facilitate rather than lead. And hopefully that covers anything, but if it doesn't, please throw a passing small child or cat at the screen and tell me, and Ben. I will assume that silence means you're happy with that. Lovely. So, Ben, we will now have a conversation.
Yep.
Let's start with why is it so hard to talk about this stuff?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. I was thinking ahead of the webinar, and I think a good starting point is the sort of paradigm that businesses, organizations, management theory has sprung from, which is essentially, Taylorist. So you've got this positivist paradigm that's underpinned by Taylorism that is kind of, I guess, the genesis of thinking about labor and work from the point of view of theory. And, Taylorism has no room for the person, for irrationality, for emotions. It's a theory of resources and flows and value created by moving through systems. And so that paradigm still pervades to this day, in many views of systems and organizations. And so it's the organization as the, if you think about it as a map, it's the tube line or the motorway network, whereas in reality, as we all know as practitioners, organizations are more like a medieval map full of dragons and strange beasts lurking at the edges and things we don't quite fully understand. So I think the first thing is its paradigm, and then secondly is that this myth of competence and an inability to acknowledge anxiety and fragility, which is really your bailiwick, I think, Steve. So you want to talk about that?
So what I went to, as I heard you talking there, Ben, was when you said dragons, I immediately went to my own inner dragons. And if I speak from I for a moment, and I go back to when I found it profoundly difficult to work with stronger emotions, particularly those are associated around anger and very visible displays of particularly masculine anger. I'm very aware of my own, if not dragons, I would probably describe them as inner small furry rabbits caught in headlights,
Okay.
Utterly terrified. There's an interplay between our inner dragons and the dragons that roam organizational landscapes.
Yes. Yeah. That's correct.
And if we go on.
And then I think this fear of not knowing, and the anxiety that goes along with that, and then how the system and how projections kind of insist on that. We can't allow our leaders not to know. We can't allow our leaders to be fallible or vulnerable in some way.
Which I'm going to be slightly mischievous, and Ben, and I know you'll probably enjoy this question as I've got to know you. Is so, how are you yourself with not knowing and your own fallibility?
Well, I mean, I think that's a journey that I've been on, and I've learned to say I don't know. I've learned to say I don't know, but I'm sure if we get our heads together, get the right people in the room. And maybe the answer to this is actually way more complex than we might hope it to be.
So one of the things that delighted me about you agreeing to do this was, and I've said this to you and I've said it to others, you're the first person in a CEO role,
right,
who has said, "Yeah, I'm up for a conversation about this stuff," not just in the abstract context, but in terms of your own personal experience. So, in a sense, part of me is kind of going, well, it's obvious why somebody in a CEO role would not talk about this stuff. But let's locate this in the role context. Why is this so hard for CEOs and for people in the C-suite to talk about this stuff? And I ask that knowing, in a sense, my own answer, but I'm interested in yours particularly.
Well, it's to do with public and private. So, CEOs and leaders will talk about it, but they'll talk about it with their coach, or they'll talk about it in a confidential setting with their family, and close friends, or maybe even a very, very close confidant in the workplace. But what's happening is there's a kind of exhaust pipe where it's kind of getting blown out. Whereas, these emotions that we're talking about, both the positive and the negative, can actually have a very useful purpose if they're somehow acknowledged and understood and contained and brought back in. And we'll talk about collusion and things later. But it's taboo. It's taboo. There's someone losing their temper, someone full of rage, someone rage and anger are taboo emotions, right? And I think it partly stems from, I think many of us may be brought up in households as well. Some of it may stem back to our early life experiences where rage and anger wasn't tolerated in the household that we were brought in, or wasn't tolerated as children, and therefore actually there's a really deep-seated defense there against being angry and what to do with rage and anger. And we might have been on the receiving end of rage and anger as children, which is a terrible place to be. So, it's no wonder it's taboo in a boardroom or in the workplace.
Yeah. And I can certainly relate to that. Whilst I wasn't on the end of any violence, certainly I was on the end of rage.
Right.
And that configured my relationship with rage throughout my life. What then kind of pops into my mind, I think it's also worth just noting that, and there is an intercultural aspect of this as well, because the way that strong emotions are worked with, handled, expressed in different cultures differs quite radically in some contexts. I think it's worth naming. So the word that I wanted to drop in here is collusion, or complicitness. How do we, and I'm thinking also here in terms of us as practitioners, and you span both camps in a sense, Ben, with your therapy practice and your CEO role. To what extent do we end up colluding with each other and becoming complicit in an omerta, a code of silence around talking about this stuff?
I was thinking about this yesterday, and so let's look at some different contexts. So there's the group setting itself, leadership team, executive team, boardroom team, whatever, project team, whatever it might be. I think we collude by either tolerating the unacceptable or not, or colluding to keep the unsayable, or keep the unknowable out of the system, out of the group. So that's one example where collusion isn't helpful. There's something in the system that's being denied, or something that's being repressed, which would be really, really helpful to get out on the table.
Right.
The second thing, I think, as practitioners, particularly in the kind of coaching setting, we have to be really careful that we don't just become convenient exhaust valves, i.e., we have like these amazing sessions with our coachees where, the client is tapping into, their emotional fragility or the rage that they're experiencing. And we think, great, okay, fantastic. I'm doing an amazing job as a coach. Because I'm allowing I'm allowing my client to get in contact with something and to blow off steam. But if we're just a convenient exhaust port for the system that the client belongs in, I kind of question how effective we're being, because something's not being fed back into the system, into the group, into the team, or into the organization that our clients are responsible for. And we can come away thinking really, really, we're really amazing coaches because but if some kind of change or some kind of action is not happening within the group or the organization that our clients are situated in, I think we have to ask ourselves, what are we colluding with here?
So where I went to there was, and again, I can track the evolution of my own practice. I absolutely recognized the part of me that did very much what you're saying, Ben. So through my own valencies and inner anxiety around, say, conflicts in early years, I would have found a way to keep myself at bay from whatever's happening within the group. Whereas now what I notice is sometimes I'm almost kind of going, well, there needs to be a rupture here. This has got to come out somehow. All right. Should we see what happens? And so I'm noting myself wanting sometimes this to burst, even knowing sometimes that it could be, if not explosive, then certainly it could be uncomfortable, because the alternative is this complicity.
Yeah. So what do we do?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, well, what popped into my head is sometimes, and I have an experience of this recently, is sometimes you just sit and wait, and you do not move from the conversation that is incredibly constipated and tense, and you don't let the group off the hook, or let yourself off the hook of sitting with and in it.
Yeah, and there's lots of ways out of it, right? Which is, let's change the subject.
Yeah.
Let's take this offline. That's the classic. Or so I propose that, and there's something gets put on the table. That's a kind.
And there's the anxiety of the practitioner.
Yeah. And it's not just as kind of consultants and coaches. It's within teams and leadership teams themselves. It's kind of, if you get, often the shortcut response, if something's getting into really difficult territory, is let's take this offline. There's something not tolerable here. We have to take it out of the group because it's toxic.
So that's lovely, because I was actually wanting just to shift the conversation slightly to, because I noticed we've been talking about through your lens as a practitioner mostly. Let's move to your lens, through the lens of you as a CEO, and respecting confidentiality of obviously where you work. But what is your own experience from being a CEO and meeting some of this stuff?
So I mean, I guess the CEO role is unique. I've had fairly sort of senior leadership positions in various businesses that I've worked, and so I think so. My experience is it's there all the time, right? You've got a very dynamic team of high performing, great leaders in and of their own right. But there's something that's interesting that happens when the team get together as a group. And I think what I've learned to do is, because of my coaching experience and because of my kind of group dynamics experience and my psychotherapy experience, is just to kind of flip between being in the work to the observer position, noticing what's happening within the group. And what I've learned, I think, is to have the confidence to name what might be happening, but without shaming. So if someone's disengaged, if someone's looking angry, it's okay to say, what's going on for you in this moment, what's happening, as long as it's not shaming. Sometimes it might be done better outside of the room, because it's not my place to either directly or inadvertently shame. So I think just observing it and naming it.
And there is a reality there, which is occupying the role with the most certainly perceived and often actual power. Then the conditions are ripe for people to experience shame relative to you in that role.
Yeah, and look, I think regardless whether you're the CEO or whether you're another senior leader, like the projections that you have to hold are pretty extraordinary at times.
Such as?
The expectation of competence, the expectation of fluency, of expertise, of knowing, but then also, the parental projections come your way, are quite a deep, kind of deep, more unconscious level, I think.
And how do you work with those, given that you understand this territory, given your therapy practice? What's your internal relationship with those?
Yeah, so just disclaimer. So psychotherapy only works within the therapeutic frame. And I say this time and again, you cannot be a psychotherapist unless you're in psychotherapy with your clients. So some of the theory, some of the experiences might inform one's way of being, but I really want to be clear that it's deeply unethical to be practicing psychotherapy. unless it's in the yeah, there we go. Answers put the
Yeah.
put this right.
Yeah.
So I'm answering this question based on what I know and what I've experienced as a therapist. Can you ask me the question again? Because I've gone too far with the disclaimer.
So I got so lost in your disclaimer. It was so what is it that goes on for you in this? You know, how is it for you in all this? If you're coming from the CEO,
Right. So there's self and other, right? So I'm it's a bit like kind of checking the wing mirrors when you're driving on the motorway in the rear view mirror. So as well as checking in with what I'm thinking, I'm checking in with what I'm feeling in my, in my emotions. I'm checking in with what I'm feeling in my body sensations. I'm also checking in with my intuition. And that is quite a rich environment from which to to use as sense making. So I have the benefit of a more, I suspect, a kind of more multi-dimensional way of kind of making sense of sense making, which is me as instrument, right? So in this context, what's happening with me right now? And then secondly, for the individuals, just an acknowledgement that these are real human beings coming in, to the room with all of their hopes, fears, anxieties, backgrounds. And then secondly, the knowledge of how groups behave, going back to Wilfred Bion as a group theory and group dynamics is incredibly valuable to understand as a leader in terms of what's happening within the group. Where are we on task? Are we not on task? Are we slipping into dependency or denial?
So we'll move shortly to some small groups, but what I wanted just to touch is it's very unusual to hear a senior leader, let alone a CEO, talk about sense making, because in my experience, I don't hear. I've worked with loads of senior leadership teams. I might hear them, invert the phrase and say, can we make sense? How do we make sense of this? But in terms of understanding of sense making and the process of sense making, which requires you to pay attention to my experience of myself and you and others, that aspect of sense making, I do not hear talked about or acknowledged much. And the other bit I think you're pointing to is, I talk about a fair amount in my book, is the importance of developing your own reflexivity.
Well, for sure.
And again, something which modern executive teams, leadership teams, and modern organizations, the need for speed, the need for perfection, the need to be right, the need to know, actively cuts and works against. Because reflexivity requires you to sharpen a way which does not normally fit with those modes. So I'm wondering the extent to which you are an outlier.
I'm not entirely comfortable with that. I think what you're saying is appropriate. It's an appropriate question to ask. But I think drawing generalizations, I think, is doing an injustice to a lot of very capable people out there. So I don't think I'm an outlier in that respect.
Okay.
I don't think I'm an outlier in that respect. I've had the opportunity, and experience throughout my career of working with some very reflexive leaders. But it's the ones who aren't that stick out. It's the ones who aren't that you remember, and maybe that's what's informing your
absolutely
your
there is, I guess, they're a far smaller subset,
right?
In terms of what I've experienced, I would say.
I think particularly in between when I first kind of came into the workplace and first started working, compared to the present day, I think things have come a long way.
So you'd say that there's an increase in those capabilities rather than a stagnation or a reduction.
Yeah. Otherwise there wouldn't be executive coaches and OD consultants working with leadership teams, bringing awareness. I think it has improved. I remember starting my career back in the 90s, in the technology industry as a consultant and going on my first organizational change management training with Darryl Connor and thinking, oh, crikey, actually the people are important here. Whereas I don't think that's the case these days for most organizations.
Lovely. Okay, let's just check if there's anything in the chat that needs tending to before we move into some more groups. So Jess, thanks Jess. So Jess works in a large corporate, so that's good to hear. Yep, captured an LR degree. Lovely. Okay, so what we'll do then is we are going to get you set up into some small groups, and we have got some questions to fuel the conversation. Do not be bound by these, but this is an invitation to obviously talk about what you've heard from me and Ben. And in your own experience, why maybe is this so hard to talk about, this stuff, these strong emotions? Or if it isn't for you, in your experience, why is that? What is the impact of these as experiences and as feelings within groups? And how do the organizational dynamics in organizations collude with or perpetuate these patterns? Okay. So that's our starting point. Take a snapshot of that, should you so desire. But obviously, feel free to roam free. That's not a straight jacket. It's just an invitation to start. I'm going to put you in groups of 3 or 4 and give you 20 minutes. Right. Should be 4 participants per room, if the maths is right. 3 or 4. And Ben, entirely up to you whether you go and join a group or you hang out with me. Any questions, people, before I send you off?
I'll stay with you, Steve.
All right. Okay. I'm going to send you off now. So let's unpin me and you. Welcome back. So we're going to have a few minutes of plenary, and it would be lovely to hear from some of you the fruits of your conversation. Feel free to stick your hand up or throw passing cat or small child at screen to alert me and Ben that you want to say something.
I'll go.
Brilliant.
I had a lovely time with what could have we think might be fellow corporate refugees, and except for perhaps for Martin, but yeah, we did work through some of the questions in a roundabout way. A couple of things that stuck for me were uh, there's a gender lens that we talked through around what it means and a different perception of expressing certain emotions for males as opposed to perhaps female in the corporate space. And the other thing we talked about is that intersectionality of cultural norms as well. We talked about, for example, myself having experience in the corporate space, very much a middle class white male sort of Anglo-Saxon norms in because I'm in Sydney, and however, having grown up in South America, being born in South America, grown up in South America, there was never any issue about whether or not emotions had a place. They were just there. They were all, and so I told my story about feeling quite torn quite often. In one hand, in a room, feeling all these emotions and thinking, well, there's nothing wrong with these emotions, and yet finding that I couldn't find a place or a space for them. And I also mentioned that I never really was able to reconcile or conquer that one. It was very much something that was reconciled through leaving, which I guess it's one way of reconciling, but maybe not.
Thanks, Paul. Other reflections? Yes, Andrew.
Hi, thank you. And we had a really enjoyable conversation, and something that I kind of have come out of it with was a sense of. So I work partly as a psychotherapist, and I think part of my story about coming into that is that I quite like getting messy and talking about difficult feelings, or at least I like the idea of it. And I've kind of I'm sitting with a question of feeling a bit of a challenge of it didn't feel like a very messy conversation. And I wonder between Steve, you and Ben, and I was wondering how much there might be a sense of actually in an organizational context, maybe there's enough talking about feelings sometimes, and the desire of maybe me as a consultant to do more talking about feelings may not always be attuned to what the level of intervention and need is, or at least some kind of difference of perspective about what's valuable in context.
Oh, what a lovely, lovely question. Any thoughts on that, Ben?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think where I immediately go to with that is kind of, who is this in service of? Is it me, or the group, or the client organization? I think that's where I go with that. Why am I asking this question? Why am I making this observation? Why? Where is this need? Where is this need coming from? So I think that's a great observation, Andrew.
So where I went to is self-indulgence, and my smugness and my expertise as a practitioner. I think I've seen something. I think I see the need. They don't see this, and I can recognise my own smugness and grandiosity. I know that part of me. So I'm interested in when that arises. What's doing that? Martin.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. One of the sort of moments of truth in the conversation we had just now for me was I was talking about how in the right domains and settings, it's not hard to talk about some of these more difficult feelings, but in professional quote unquote corporate settings, it can be much harder. And I was remembering how when I used to work at London Business School, it was not allowed, quote unquote, to talk about these things, even though actually everyone kind of knew they were going on and would talk about them behind their hand. And I suppose one of the moments of truth was around the role of anxiety in all of this, and the sort of sense of when there's a lot of anxiety in the system that's not being processed, somehow this stuff becomes less okay to talk about. That's certainly my own experience. So when I'm wearing my chief exec hat in my own business, and that tends to be a role in which I'm more driven by anxiety to deliver. I find it much harder to access the skills that I have as an OD practitioner, as a coach.
Which then introduces the whole range of social defences against anxiety, which we were alluding to, Ben, when we were talking earlier. But that's lurking there. How do we defend ourselves against these strong emotions? Martin?
Thanks, Steve. I guess just to build a little bit there on what other Martin was saying, hello Martin. One of the things that jumped out for us was a sense that recently, on one side, on the side of love and kindness, there has been definitely a bit of we see a lot more of that talked about in a kind of corporate framing. one of the questions that brought up for us was how much that feels that that's helpful in some instances, but in other ways, does that actually provide a further layer of stuff you've got to get through before you can get to the sort of shame and rage and anxiety and hate. So there's a sort of, it's now okay to talk about the good side, but the dark side feels still some way out of reach from the main conversation.
Well, I immediately went to there, Martin, I felt myself moved to asking, how are you with your dark side? And I'm talking to you and all of us here, because it's easy to talk about it out there, but then it's also in parallel processes is asking us to think about where we are in relation to both those aspects of ourselves. As Andrew just put in the chat, this whole notion of bring your whole self to work. Really, as I often say when people talk about this, you really want Grumpy Steve? You really want that version of me that's had 2 hours sleep? Sure, you can have him, by all means. Simon, let's hear from you, and then we'll go into another conversation.
I like what you said, Steve. You said my smugness and grandiosity as a practitioner. I know that side of myself. And then you asked, what is it that causes that to rise? And I thought panic, basically. And I thought that vicious circle you can end up in as a practitioner, where when you most need to access that kind of self-reflexivity and ability to pause in the moment, probably under some pressure, whether that's in a group or a one-to-one situation, is least available. This is a sort of self-debilitation there, and then you might pick it up yourself afterwards, or it might come up through something like a supervision. But I think it's often a very painful position to be in, because those are quite sort of shameful. Well, at least in our culture specifically, or particularly, quite shameful things to sort of notice that you've done and catch yourself. You might catch yourself in a moment, but that probably compounds the panic. The other thing I thought, just on the lines of the sort of difficulty in talking about these things, is I think a bit of a floodgates effect of whether that be the organisation, do we take initiatives on this or not, the individual manager, us as practitioners as well, is well, if we try and go there a bit, is this going to be like a sort of dam collapsing and everyone get washed away, and basically we might catastrophize it, or the organisation or a manager trying to operate in this way might catastrophize it and think better not to. Maybe I'll do more harm than good by opening that floodgate. Better have it be a little valve, and that's not great, that's dysfunctional, but I don't want to take the risk of what might happen if I go there. Sometimes well-founded and sometimes not.
And what popped into my mind hearing you talk there was, I did do an intervention online in the middle of COVID with a group where I went there and the anxiety could not be contained, and me and my colleague got spat out. And that's possible. The other place I went was, the reason why I'm so aware of my own grandiosity is because it's a short hop and skip and jump to my awareness of my own inherent absurdity, which I'm very aware of and very comfortable in. Just as a side point, I would gently invite you all and us all to consider whether you are ever in your work with clients aware in the moment of just how absurd you might look, sound, and feel.
I think just briefly, these are very real risks. I was speaking to another, to a group practitioner recently, very established, extremely competent person, had gone there with a certain group. The details of what it was don't matter. Had gone to a certain place. He was summarily fired by email by the regional director about 90 minutes after the group finished.
Right. There we go. Good. So I'm going to put you in, we're looking at the watch, I'm going to put you in for just over 15 minutes with a slightly different set of questions, which look a little bit like these. So when have you personally experienced strong emotions and worked with them? And how might you collude in ignoring them, and why? And that's, in a sense, Simon, I think what we were partly dancing around there. And this third question, which was actually one I particularly like that Ben came up with, when have you experienced a moment where strong emotions have been felt, acknowledged, shared, and worked with, leading to a moment of clarity, growth, or transformation, or something else? Okay. And again, these are starting points, and feel free to roam off-piste and go feral in your inquiry should you so desire. Okay. So, allow you to take a picture of that should you so desire. I will leave it there for 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All good? Ready to go? Okay, rooms are opening now. You still there, Hannah? No, don't know. No. Welcome back. False alarm in the message I sent you. I don't think Zoom is recording the breakouts. It appears to be a false alarm. You're safe. Big Brother has not been watching you. Okay.
You mean I could have said what I actually thought in the breakout?
Totally, Jeff. You could have, Jeff.
What you
I don't
didn't,
think
Jeff?
I was about to say, Jeff, I don't think there's anybody would stop you saying what you really think. So don't tell us a porky. So as before we do a bit of a wrap up, fruits of your conversations. What would you like to? Thank you, Laura. You go first.
Okay, I promised my group I'd put my hand up because the first thing we talked about was my anger and rage that no women had spoken in the first section. And I really, really was feeling very angry about it. And then I thought, well, actually, a lot of women will experience that, or, how do you talk about that in work and what do you do with it? Because that was certainly the whole self of me that you would not want at work. And then we talked about I guess 2 different stories. So Emily works internally, and she said that she works with 3 women. You can see the theme carried on, and that each year they organise a conference. Each time they fall out massively organising it, and then they say, "Oh, that was fantastic, wasn't it?" So there was something in the falling out that made the work really enjoyable. And then I shared a story where I worked with a charity whose be-all and end-all is collaboration, but they'd gone through a restructure, and I ran what was supposed to be a healing workshop, which of course wasn't. It all fell apart. They couldn't agree what they wanted to do. So I sent them off for a walk, not knowing if they'd even come back. But they did come back, and the final 2 minutes were useful. But, there was something for us about the fact that, okay, there's an intervention in that moment that works, but then we leave that organization, we have no idea what the after impact is. Yeah. Anyway, I'll stop there.
And just so you know, Ben and I, as soon as you all thundered off, we also commented on the fact that we'd only heard from.
Yeah, I was raging at the both of you, so thank you for noting it.
Yeah.
Well, we had noticed, but there's an interesting thing just to say is, I think before Simon spoke, had I decided to carry on a bit longer, I would have said, but as a kind of parallel process, what those moments in organizations where rage arises because we feel that we are being ignored, excluded, or others are dominating. Something that me and Andrew Grenfell have talked about recently is the extent to which we are complicit in what we experience sometimes. I'm not saying you were, Laura, at all, but I'm using it as a jumping off point into our complicitness in co-creating that which we find infuriating and enraging. Emily.
I think that the point that Laura just ended on, so I was in the same group as Laura, was around that length of relationship with people in order to get into that space where you are able to express your feelings. So the example where I work with these other 2 colleagues is that we've worked together for a long time, so we know each other well. So that freedom, if you like, to express that anger in those meetings is there because it's within a context of a longer term. I know you when you're not angry.
So I've seen you at your worst.
Yes, and it matters to me as to kind of what it. And the other thing we talked about was how sometimes when you are in situations where it becomes about the emotion rather than the thing that led you to be angry.
Nice. Other thoughts? Sarah?
Didn't know whether to say this or not, but I just thought it was quite interesting to comment on sort of anger being associated with seeing people at their worst, because I think like anger is also sort of telling you something about a situation, isn't it? So I think it's funny how we do label like anger is bad, like this is good, and we sort of put those labels kind of around things, whereas actually like it's kind of like little signals, isn't it, that there's something going on sort of in the system, or within yourself or within the dynamics, isn't it? So it's not like a bad thing necessarily, but what is that then leaning sort of into us? So I just wanted to sort of just say that in the moment, really.
Totally,
Love it, Sarah.
Yeah,
Ben?
Absolutely. No, I was just going to say, absolutely, Sarah. It's kind of, it's a what's happening question.
There's another bit to that, Sarah, which is I sometimes make a distinction between aggression and anger. So for me, aggression is actually, when it's not used as an attack, and aggression is a life force. Aggression comes from fight, flight. Is there something rustling in the bushes? Do I need to run from a saber-toothed creature, or do I need to fight the saber-toothed creature? And organizations have many saber-toothed furry animals. So, that urge, that aggression that arises in us, it's not about necessarily throttling someone or something, but it is the thing that motivates and mobilizes. So some of my own work in the last 10 years has been to get comfortable with and get in touch with my own aggression, and to use it with positive intent and appropriately, and not to deny that it exists. So yeah, thank you for bringing that. Joe?
Just to add to the gender lineup here, I guess what I was noticing here is that, yeah, we are talking about anger with the assumption that we are ignoring it. And as a person who's quite in touch with anger, but as we've spoken about, Steve, it's righteous anger. Actually, the anger that I share is covering up something else. And so it's like the primary emotion is going out there and it's big and strong, but it's still serving as a kind of covering, protective. There's still something further that needs to, I'm kind of colluding with myself, I guess, in a way.
Well, that gets to between when is anger a defensive strategy? I offer you my anger to keep you at bay and to keep myself safe. Yeah. And I don't think we can go too far then from the gender thing. And again, I'm going to tip my hat to Andrew, because Andrew's done some really interesting research around masculinity and power. I think, Andrew, that probably touches on some of the stuff we've spoken about, I suspect.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying listening to lots of women in this discussion, and I think that the masculinity is coming out really nicely in what they're in what I'm hearing.
Lovely. So, any more contributions before we slowly wrap up?
Did anybody have any examples to share? I think we've heard from Laura and Emily around, the work with the charity. Did anybody have any other examples to share on point 3, which is where, naming the emotion, acknowledging the emotion has actually, led to change, or led to something that's changed?
I can offer one where in a group, as the facilitator, I asked the leader of the group how they were feeling, and they in a way that was totally sort of at odds with how they were apparently showing up, talked about how overwhelmed they were feeling and how frustrated with everybody else they were, and actually that caused the rest of the group actually to kind of metaphorically put their arms around this person and kind of go, well, that's not okay. If you're feeling like that, then there's something wrong here, and we need. But it was in the context of the previous session we'd done, them having had a much more destructive sort of set of encounters around sharing how they were feeling. And I almost sort of feel like that second, much more kind of constructive encounter wouldn't have been possible without the much messier one earlier, where, to the point that other people were making earlier, I could well have been kicked out for sort of allowing that if they'd been different kinds of people. So that would be my experience there. But I suppose I was also musing on something I don't think we've talked about directly, which is, how this stuff is often floating around unconsciously, and becomes almost like a property of the group. Yeah. So it may be that one individual expresses it, but actually they're doing it on behalf of the group almost.
That's what I was wondering when you were talking about that example, where with this senior leader who, when invited, was able to share. With a group rescuing something when they were seeking to reassure, or was it a genuine kind of concern, or both?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both, and actually also a bit of trying to make up for having, said and done some things previously that they felt slightly ashamed of, and
right.
That we'd not quite been able to name. So but it helped move something forward.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
Lovely. So we're going to do Kate and Andrew. Can you nutshell your contributions, and then we're going to wrap. Kate, you first.
Certainly, thank you. So in a nutshell, it was just two concepts that came actually to the fore in the first discussion that we had about labelling the strong emotions, and Marshall Rosenberg's work in NVC, nonviolent communication, about what you are feeling and what you need, and how hard it is to really label that. And also Nancy Klein's work on time to think, because we don't have the time generally in organizations to create that space to even just be with ourselves, let alone with other people's emotions.
Lovely. Thank you, Kate. And Andrew, final contribution?
For me, I was just reflecting that I think male emotions and female emotions often get expressed and processed and responded to very differently in organizations, and maybe at different points. But I think just to draw out the gender difference, I think emotions and the expression of emotions often get very heavily distinguished or responded to very differently, especially when you've got a gender bias in leadership.
Lovely. Thank you, Andrew. So we're going to close here. Just two things to share with you. One, I'm hoping that the next session is going to be around how neurodiversity and difference shows up in practice. We talk a lot about how these show up in client systems and clients, but we don't talk about how those differences actually might mean that the reason why practitioners are as effective as they are is precisely because of the way in which they make sense of the world, very differently to some of their peers. So that is likely to be the next one. The other thing I just want to, if you are interested in this, what we talked about today and the adjacent territories, in February in London, I'm running this. It's a one-day workshop, which is a deep dive into your own fragility as a practitioner or as a leader. It is not therapy, I hasten to add. I haven't got Ben with me, so there is no certified therapist in the room. But it is an opportunity for you to genuinely rub up against some aspects of your shadow. As one person who attended this in Australia with me over the summer said, he left the session redefined. You can ask him what he means by that. If you want, I can put you in touch. But that was his experience of it. So if you're interested in that, either drop me a line or just scan the QR code. I'm also hoping to do it again in Australia. For those of you here on the webinar from Australia, I'm currently plotting with the lovely Josie and Paul and others to return to your fair land next year, I hope, and plotting some shenanigans once more in your neck of the woods. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for coming. I hope that was useful, and I hope to see you again at some point. And Ben, huge thanks to you.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Thanks, everybody. It's been great.
And yes, see you all again. Go well, stay warm, and have a lovely weekend. And the recording will be up soon.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, right.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you, Steve. See you, Ben.
Take care,
Thank
mate.
you.
Nice to see you, Marcus.
Whoops, have I just turned my camera off? No. Is my camera off, Steve?
No.
No. That's weird.
No, I can see you. Yeah, you're